And if there was ever a man who needs no introduction, it's Jim McAllister. Most of you are here because one way or another, you're part of his prodigious fan club. You've taken his tours, been on an elder hostel event with him, attended his lectures at the Hawthorne Hotel, or perhaps, like me, have been following Jim's almost daily life-saving lectures since lockdown and have learned more about Salem's history, colorful characters, and imagery than you ever thought possible. Thank you, Jim. Well, here we go again. So today, Jim will talk to us about one of Salem's most famous sons, architect and woodcarver Samuel McIntire, and the district which bears his name and in which the Pickering House sits. So I think Jim will take questions after he talks, but let's get started. I'll turn the program over to Jim, and thank you for doing this.
All right, thank you, Linda. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks everybody for coming up. You know, it's 100 people, that's a lot, and hope the volume's all right. And so let's get started. You know, it's funny, I'm putting this thing together, and you know, I know quite a bit about McIntire, and I've done a lot of lectures and tours and whatever, you know, related to him or whatever, but I always go back and start from scratch, and I'm putting the whole thing together and feeling pretty comfortable about it. And then I get a thing from John Wright, said, well, I think today's Dean Lahakainen's final day at the Peabody Essex. He's retiring. And as soon as I heard the word Dean or heard his name come up, I said, Dean should be doing this lecture, not me. He's the expert or whatever, but that's all right. This is McIntire 101, you know, and I'm going to start off just with this image as background at the house at 12 Chestnut, and we'll get back to that a little bit later on. And okay, wait a minute now. What's going on here? Hang on, folks. There's always, okay, there we go. All right, there's a picture. I borrowed a bunch of images from the Peabody Essex Museum. I hope they won't mind. I promote them whenever I can. And we'll start off with this wonderful portrait of McIntire. I put everything into black and white because I hate going back and forth from color to black and white. But so there's McIntire, wonderful portrait of him. Right, the only one that pretty much exists, or whatever. And he was born in 1757 in Salem. And he was born at the Ruck House, which is right around the corner, or was right around the corner from what's now the McIntire district, the district that takes his name. And that's one of the richest architectural neighborhoods in the country. So, but there's the Ruck House. And if you were at Dunkin' Donuts down on Washington Street, and you went across to the post office, you would have run right into the side of this building in the old days. And this whole area was cleared, and now the post office is there. And the Ruck House, his mother was a Ruck, and the Ruck House had some connections way back in 1692 to the witch trials, you know, sort of very tangential. And then later on, not too long after McIntire was born, John Singleton Copley lived here for a while. So kind of an interesting house. And he was born into a family of house rights. You know, his father, his uncle, his grandfather, his cousins, nephews, everybody else. You know, practically he and his brothers became house rights. And, you know, that meant they worked with wood. They'd be carpenters. They might work on ships. They might work on houses. They might do carving. But it was just in the genetics of the family. And he had a good head start in the industry because of his family connections. But somewhere early on, life threw him a curveball, the type you really like. And he came across the radar screen of a guy named Elias Haskett Derby. And Derby was still a relatively young guy. And in his 30s, he was living in this wonderful mansion, the Derby House, now part of the Salem Maritime National Historic Site. And he had taken over his father's, running the father's fleet in the wharf. And Derby Wharf only went out at that point to about where the beach is, where the single building now on it, and wasn't extended until 1806 afterwards. So, and Derby never went to sea, but he was just a real shrewd businessman. And when I said he was very lucky to come across his radar screen, is because Derby, even though he was not like the Browns and the Pickmans, you know, the real big money people, you know, he had one couple things good going for him. And one is that he was an incredible entrepreneur and businessman. And the second thing, he was a patriot in Salem. And, you know, the reality is by 1768, just as McIntire is really starting to get into the prime of his work career, it'd be like, you know, just 1760. Well, he's going to be starting his work career. Anyway, what happens is Salem becomes very strictly a patriotic town, and they start really putting the lumber to a lot of the Tories, and eventually almost all the Tories will have to leave. So while William Brown leaves, one of the richest men in Salem, is never allowed to come back. He's banished for life and all his property is confiscated. Benjamin Pickman, another great merchant, he leaves and he doesn't come back for 10 years until he figures it's safe. So if McIntire had been attached to either of them, he would have been gonzo, because they certainly weren't going to get him any work from not being around. But Derby stayed. He was a patriot, and he went privateering, and he made a fortune during the Revolution privateering. And after the war, he really sort of set the tone for the whole East India trade that followed. And Salem at the time of the Revolution was supposedly the 7th largest city in America, and it was certainly one of the most active ports. And after the Revolution, in the next 30 years, it would become one of the richest cities in America, and there was just awash with money. And Elias Derby, of course, led the way, and he had the money, and he had his architect and builder, and McIntire. So McIntire, right during the war, actually in 1780, I mean, the war is still a couple years from wrapping up, the Derbys decide they want to build a bigger house. So McIntire is brought in to do the building. And, there's no trained architects really in the country at that time, but he starts building this building, and partway through it, the Derbys say, abandon that project, just leave it for now. We got another project. And they had bought up near on Washington Street, up near where Church and Federal come into it, there on the west side, there was the big Pickman house. Look at the size of the thing, absolutely enormous. And so the Derbys bought it, and they brought in McIntire to retrofit it. And he made all sorts of major changes and did the little barn on the left-hand side, and the whole process, and became a very high visibility process. So they move in there, and now McIntire's starting to make a bunch of money. So he gets married at age 21 to a woman named Elizabeth, and he has enough money within a few years, after living with her family for a while, Elizabeth Fields. He buys a piece of property on Summer Street, 31 Summer, and builds a house for himself. And it was originally only 2 stories. The third was added after his ownership. And this building was there until about 1971. And Holyoke Insurance tore it down to build their new addition, or whatever. So now he has a house. He has a kid, a couple years after they got married. So he's settling into sort of a nice, steady stream in life. And what he does is he starts not only building, but designing houses. And of course, people back at that time, you didn't go to school if you were in McIntire's position to become an architect. You got all these wonderful books written by the Langleys and books by Palladio, and there was a whole series of them. McIntire owned them all. And when you went to build a house for somebody, you'd open them up and you'd look and you say to the guy, you want a little of this, little of that. And, that's what you did. You sort of became self-taught through the world of books, which is what a lot of us do in the history world. So there's a book by Palladio who have a tremendous impact on his career a little bit later on. So what happens is a man comes into his life in the late 1780s, and not personally, but professionally, and then a little bit later on personally. And his name is Charles Bulfinch. And Bulfinch comes back home from a few years in Europe. He'd done the grand tour over there, and comes back, I think, to Boston area in 1787. And he's been exposed to Robert Adams, who's developed this whole new style of architecture based on really ancient classical architecture, which in turn was based on the excavations they had done at Pompeii and Herculaneum, and that was the rage in a lot of Europe at that time. And Adams made it popular in the British Isles. And then Bulfinch had also come into contact with the work of Christopher Wren and others. So he comes back, and he's bringing the gospel of European architecture to Boston, and he starts and creates this whole what they call the Adamesque Federal School of Architecture, very delicate neoclassical. So when Elias Derby decides he wants to build even a bigger mansion, he doesn't bring in McIntire per se, but he brings in Bulfinch, and also solicits plans from other people from, I think, New York. And he wants to build a mansion approximately where Old Town Hall is today, in Derby Square. And you look at the size of this thing, absolutely enormous. And we're looking at it from Essex Street. So on the left would be the bookstore, used to be Derby Square bookstore, and on the right would be the old Nomkeg Bank building. So look at the size of it. It's just absolutely enormous. And so Bulfinch does a lot of the preliminary drawings. And this thing on the back, it went all the way down to Front Street practically. And of course, Front Street was at that point water. So it's just this beautiful, beautiful, one of the great mansions of America. And then McIntire was brought in to do the finish work, so it was really a sort of a combination of what Bulfinch and maybe others and McIntire brought to the table. So the thing is finished in 1798, 99, and the Derbies move in and they both die within about a year of moving in. And the thing sits there for about 16 years and then is torn down and the land given to the town to build what's now Old Town Hall. So what a tragedy. And Bentley, Reverend Bentley, in his diaries goes up to watch the tearing down. Just, he had to walk away, just horrible, because we're talking one of the great mansions in the country. So because McIntire was connected to Derby, things really just went wonderfully from that point on, because if you were good enough for King Derby, you were good enough for everybody else, because he really set the tone in many aspects of Salem life before he died in 1798 or 99. But one of the neat things is when they tore that building down, I assume they tore the little barn buildings on either side down. But no, one day I was walking down Briggs Street, almost to Webb, and on the left, this house had just been painted. They had a new plaque on it. And this was one of the barn buildings from the Derby estate. And sure enough, the dates coincided and somebody had bought it at auction and moved it down to Briggs Street. So some of that still lives. And so, by the way, Bulfinch also did a couple of buildings in Salem, and I'm sure everybody's familiar with this one if you go to Reds. And this is the old Salem Fraternity building, just opened up as like a new high-end decor shop of some sort or other, which is kind of interesting. But anyway, this was a Bulfinch building, and it was built in 1811, the same year that McIntire died. And I always kind of say, I wonder if they had some turf arrangement. You know, Bulfinch says, I'll stay out of Salem if you stay out of Boston. You know, I doubt it, but anyway, kind of interesting. Beautiful building. So, but it's tragic, of course, that the Derby mansion's gone. You know, again, it was one of the great, great mansions. The interior drawings are just stunning. You know, this big oval room right in the middle of it. And just, God, it was just, you know, they spared no expense. You know, the cupola, everything about it was just magnificent. And other buildings of McIntire designed are gone. And one of them was the old Registry of Deeds. And this is 1 Broad Street, which is now condominiums, but it was the old Salem Normal School, which opened in the 1850s. And to build that, they tore down McIntire's Registry of Deeds. And I've never seen anywhere an image of it. I don't even know if one of them exists, but had been designed by McIntire. Another tremendous loss of McIntire buildings was the old courthouse. And this was built in 1785. You know, his drawings, I think the city and the county shared the building. It was a courthouse in the middle of Washington Street. And right again about where, well, across the street from the courthouse, they just tore down the old district court building right in that area. So, but, and on the left was probably the Derby mansion that he would retrofitted for the Derby family just before they built the courthouse. But anyway, George Washington addressed the people of Salem from the balcony there, and McIntire made sure he was well situated to do a drawing of him, a profile. And that he turned into a medallion or a carved bust, or half medallion, and that ended up on the Salem Common when they turned the Salem Common into this beautiful military training ground around 1800, 1801. McIntire was asked to design the entryways. There were 4 of them. This was the most majestic, facing what's now the Witch Museum. So the medallion of George Washington was on there, and McIntire also carved the eagle and designed and did some of the other carving on it, the swags, etc. But it's very interesting. There was a guy named Hiller did an engraving of Washington, on his own, and they cast 8 or 9, or McIntire carved 8 or 9 different versions of it. And this one showed up on Antiques Roadshow, and one of the Keno brothers, who were always entertaining, decided the thing was worth $70,000 to $90,000. And this guy's ancestor picked it up off the streets in Boston after a celebration of something or other. So pretty nice score. But another Antique Roadshow find was this lovely, lovely grandmother and granddaughter. The granddaughter was probably about 15. The grandmother had just given her granddaughter this bellows, for fire. And they actually used it periodically at holidays, and it had beautiful carving on it. Well, whoever the man who looked at it for them, the evaluator, said this was done by McIntire, and he showed pictures of other items that had that same basket of fruit that McIntire had carved, and very clearly it looks just like McIntire. But it was interesting when they put the thing up. He kept saying it was by McIntire. He had School of McIntire. So I don't know. Some point when he got to do the assessment, he decided he had to hedge his bets a little bit. But and of course, there's that basket of fruit. And I'm not going to talk hardly at all about carving because it's just a universe unto its own. McIntire was really as well known for his carving as he was for his architecture, during his lifetime, and it's all over the place. I mean, so many people will call me and say, well, I live in a McIntire house. They mean they have a McIntire mantle, or it looks like one. But a few years back, Dean Lahakainen, who, as I said, just retired apparently, he did the Bible. He did this huge coffee table book that sold for over $100 on just McIntire's carving, and what an extraordinary document. So, and there's some external carving around that you can see puttering around town. And I took this the other morning I was walking somebody's beagles. Beagles are pulling me one way and I'm trying to get this shot or whatever. My gloves are falling, but worked out all right. But this is a little tea house behind the Gardner Pingree house on Essex Street. And it shows, it's a McIntire tea house, and it shows some of his carving. And this was just a little place where you went out and had a mint julep or a glass of tea. But you look at the swags, you look at the Corinthian capitals on top of the pilasters and the urns and everything. I mean, the guy just had incredible talent. And there's another tea house that he did. It's now over at Glen Magna. And again, he did a lot of the external carving, but there were 4 statues on the top of it. And it was interesting. He didn't do the statues. He turned that over to the Skillins in Boston. But I think I've read different experts and said that his carving was as good as the Skillins. He probably just didn't have time. But it was interesting. Both these tea houses got moved at some point during their careers and ended up in different locations. And the last thing I'll say about carving was that McIntire also carved furniture like bellows, for example, or chairs or whatever people brought to them. And he did a lot of work for the Sandersons. And this house, the Pelletiers lived there on one side, and right behind it, there's another house built for Jacob Sanderson. Jacob and Elijah Sanderson were really some of the premier post-Revolutionary War, they say cabinet makers, but that's really insulting. I mean, they were great furniture makers. And not only that, they were great exporters of furniture. They were a major industry in Salem. And I read somewhere there was a list of almost 100 furniture makers and cabinet makers and carpenters that came to Salem to work after the Revolution. McIntire was so lucky to live when he did because, number one, Derby took him on and sort of set the tone for him and business-wise. And then after that, once Derby wanted him, the door was open for him to all sorts of business. But there was just so much money roaming around and so much culture. The East India Marine Society opened during his lifetime, the Athenaeum towards the end of his life. And there were artists came here, and it was just everything. It was just like the city was just awash in like finery. And you had the Sandersons contacting him constantly and saying, we need carving on this or that. So when he could, he would fit that in. So he worked very well with other people. So let's take a walk around Salem, see some of the McIntire areas, and end up in the district. And this was back in 1957. They had this McIntire bicentennial celebration, the 200th anniversary of his birth. And they had a actual symposium, which quite a few people came to, but they estimated that 10,000 people came during those 2 days, which was not abnormal for Salem back then when they would have the Chestnut Street days, to go on a tour. And they had this little brochure and you could walk around. So we could tour using that. I found a copy of that brochure somewhere, or we could use the more contemporary one, the McIntire Historic District Walking Tour, which was created about 50 years after the symposium. That was created by the Salem Partnership in conjunction with, I think, Salem Maritime National Park, I hope. And they put out a booklet, and they also around town in the McIntire district, they created these, little metal things on the ground or whatever. So you follow them around. So anyway, but before we do the whole district, let's head off to some of the other historic districts very, very briefly. There's 4 historic districts in Salem. One we'll ignore because there's no McIntire connections. But the Salem Common, which is known as the Washington Square Historic District, and it's pretty much the buildings around the Common. And when they create a historic district, you're allowed to be exempted. And once you're in, though, you're in for life. I always say, till death do us part doesn't mean much at the altar anymore. But boy, in a historic district, sue to get out, doesn't matter, you're not getting out. So there's a bunch of buildings on the Washington Square Historic Districts, a couple of funeral homes, for example, that asked to be omitted, and at least one private residence, but others like the Hawthorne Hotel made sure they were included. But this was an early McIntire, 1780s. And again, then, he's got these wonderful books, Langley's books and others. And, he can constantly adding to his collection of them. And, he's just using them, take a little of this, a little of that. And, this building to us doesn't look like it's, the great McIntires we're used to, but George Washington, when he came here in 1789, was actually invited to stay there, but he didn't. But he went by and said, wow, what a beautiful mansion. So, but, you've got that wonderful Georgian style doorway. And what's going on after the revolution in the 1780s, the Georgian is giving way to the Federalist, because we're no longer servants of King George. We're now the Federalist era started in this country. And also the architecture will change to the Adamesque Federal that Bulfinch brings. So, and here's a building in the Adamesque Federal style. And now what you have is you have symmetry and simplicity really on the facades of it. And you look at this building, this is Clifford Crown and Shield building, built around 1804, somewhere around there. I'm not too big on dates, right across the street from the basketball court on the Common. And Clifford Crown and Shield, big mariner, I think his vessel, the Minerva, I think was the name of it, was the first to circumnavigate the world, the first Salem vessel. But anyway, this was built for him. And you can see again how simple the facade is. The windows are usually 6/6 windows, double hung, and over the top of the window, you might have a very simple lintel or hood. And the third floor windows were always foreshortened. I always say if you want to start a war saying that was for tax purposes, that's because it was the servants' quarters, or that was for perspective because you're looking up at it, but maybe all three. But the doorway was where most of the action was in an Adamesque Federal building. And again, symmetry was very critical to that style. But the doorway now, you no longer have the, the pedimented cap doorway. Now what you have is a fan light window over the doorway. And that's one of the main characteristics of an Adamesque Federal building. The side lights, the little windows on both sides of the door go down about halfway. And now you usually have like a portico that extends out over it. It might be square, rectangular, or rounded. And oftentimes they'll have a little balustrade on the top of it. They had a hip roof, which means it's sort of like, sometimes pyramidal, but anyway, they comes up from all four sides. They weren't gables. And again, symmetry was very critical. You always had the doorway in the middle and usually the same number of windows in each side. Now that building, the Crown and Shield building, was a couple doors down to one side of the first one I showed you on the Common. This is a couple going up north towards the end of Briggs Street, right next to what was until recently the Knights of Columbus. And this building, I think, was actually asked to be excluded from the district when they set it up, but you don't have to worry. Look at how beautiful it was. And Fisk Kimball, who was really a great authority, and a lot of times they say buildings are attributed to McIntire based on his research. And he didn't leave a lot in writing, so a lot of times you're guessing what's a McIntire and what isn't. But anyway, he attributed this to McIntire based on style, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you notice, again, you get a better look at the doorway. Again, this has got a rectangular portico rather than a rounded and or semicircular. You can see over the window, the lintels, those are keystone lintels because it's got a little keystone like the state of Pennsylvania has it. And the third floor windows, again, flush up to the eaves, this particular one. But again, the windows are 6/6. So, but anyway, this has just got all the elegance in the world. But when you, and it's completely different. This is, you see the simplicity and there's just sort of a delicateness. And that was a lot of the, with that Adamesque Federal style, it was a lot more delicate. And you compare it to a building that looks similar like it in shape or whatever. Third floor windows are foreshortened, symmetry, et cetera. But this building, this is the Pierce Nichols and on Federal Street. And I always tell people, this thing looks like it could take a direct hit from a bomb. It's so solidly built and everything's like heavily massed. Look over the windows and compare that to what we just saw. So, but that was a lot of the change with the Adamesque Federal style leading up to it. In the 1780s and early 1790s, this is what you'd see, a lot heavier massing and not really as delicate. And that's what Bulfinch brought to the table and McIntire helped popularize. And here's sort of the McIntire's great creation in terms of domestic architecture anyway. This is the Gardner Pingree House, and much to the absolute joy of the Essex Institute, now the Peabody Essex Museum, In 1933, the Pingree House, who owned it, just family that owned it, just gave it to the Essex Institute. And what a wonderful, wonderful gift, because again, it was considered McIntire's, great achievement in terms of domestic architecture. But when they restored it after they got it, they didn't do much of a job on it, really. And, in fact, they kind of butchered it, but so things were changed a little bit. But look at this. You see, again, you've got the 12/12 windows, and look at all the excitement on the around the doorway. You've got those pilasters. I always tell kids, if you can hug it, it's a column. If you can't hug it, it's a pilaster, a half column or whatever. And they've got a couple extra ones on the back, between the door and each window. You've got that belt course running between the second and third floor, first and second floor, and again, the second and third floor. The symmetry is there. And just, again, very simple, very delicate, very lovely. And the doorway, you have all the excitement over it. And, they gave it a little bit of extra zip with the, the portico overhead. And what happened was in the 1980s, the Essex Institute decided to redo it and do it right. And Dean Lahakaina, I think, just led the charge. And they brought people in, all these experts, and they really undid the interior and then redid it. They did all this research. They did everything they could to take it back to what it would have looked like in John Gardner's time. And by the way, Gardner, so typical of the time, Gardner made a fortune in the maritime trade. I think he was married to one of Elias Derby's daughters, and he had a fleet of his own. And then one or two bad voyages, and he was bankrupt. He had to sell the house, and he was a tenant in there before he moved off somewhere else. So anyway, the building was restored, and the thing got a huge play, national publicity. Americana magazine in '89 did a big article on restored and doing it right. And they had a big grand opening. And there's Fred, look at that, Fred Barry in the middle and Tony Salvo in the back. And I'm not sure who the two officers from the Peabody Essex are. I have a guess. But anyway, it was a real big deal, and they said finally McIntire's crowning achievement got the attention that it deserved. Then right across the street, built just after he finished the Gardner Pingree House for John Gardner, McIntire is believed to have done the initial design or the design for this building. It was later the Father Matthew Temperance Society. It's numbered 129. And again, the doorway, very typical or very similar to the one across the street, although this building's gone through so many changes, and on the first floor particularly been restored. So, but anyway, it's a beauty, and what a great pair of bookends for people walking down the streets of it. Another building in the downtown area, the Custom House, again attributed to McIntire, and this is where the trolley depot is, and this is the Central Seaside. They have a replica of an eagle. McIntire was a great carver of eagles, and this was the Federal period. So, and the Custom House again was here. He had nothing to do with the one on Derby Street because he was long gone when that was built. But the Custom House was built at the top of Central Street because the waterfront really came right into the bottom of the street, went way on into the post office. And the town wharf was really right at the bottom of the street. So, but down in Derby Street, the Derby Street Historic District, it just really entails a stretch of Derby Street down to English or Webb, from Hawthorne Boulevard, I think, and then, a little bit on the side street so you can get in the House of the Seven Gables. But it's really just mainly Derby Street. And there's some interesting buildings up and down the street, obviously, and a lot of triple deckers that came along later. But there's a couple McIntire buildings, and this one has been so mauled over the years, just about everything about it's changed, but you can see the basic shape of it, that late Georgian or early Federals, I guess, prior to the Adam S. Federal style. It still had a lot of the same elements. It just wasn't that delicate. That late Georgian, early Federal style still had the foreshortened 3/4 windows, the symmetry, that hip roof goes up from all four sides, and the chimneys got thinner and thinner as the Adam S. Federal style took hold. And sometimes you see these Adam S. Federal chimneys on houses, and you're looking to go, Christ, how are those things still standing? You see them bowed at like about a 40-degree angle, But so this was built by Simon Forrester, and he left Ireland. He was a farm boy with a college education, and just hopped on a boat, married Nathaniel Hawthorne's Aunt Rachel, went to work for the Derbys, and became like a very famous privateer and an incredibly rich merchant. And so he was able to hire McIntire to, they think, Fisk-Kimball says, to design this building for him, looking at his wharf, which is right across the street, Central Wharf. And then right next to it, much later on in his career, this was designed by McIntire, they know, for Benjamin Crowninshield. And of course, this is now the Brook House for Aged Women. And on the right is the Custom House. And this was kind of interesting because at the time McIntire was living, the money was just pouring into Salem, as I said earlier, and there was just so much building going on and so much culture and, just money to be made everywhere, really, up until about the War of 1812 with some bumps in the road. And but it was also a period of incredible political hatred and unrest, and not too unsimilar, what we're dissimilar from today. But anyway, this was kind of interesting because McIntire worked a lot for Derby, and people came up through the ranks of Derby and people connected to Derby's who were all Federalists, the old ship owners, political party. Well, the Crowninshields were, despite the fact that they were very wealthy ship owners, just like Derby and a lot of the other Federalists, they became like the sort of leading family of the Jeffersonian Republicans. And if you look at them, they didn't really belong there, but they had certain quirks to their personality and attitude. So it's kind of interesting. I always say to people, if this was one of the last things that McIntire did, I said, if Derby was probably rolling over in his grave, knowing that McIntire, his protege there, was building designing a mansion for Benjamin Crowninshield, who was really one of the enemy political parties. But by the way, President Monroe stayed here for a few days when he visited Salem. So, and this building's still there. And of course, they've added on to it time and time again. But so that was one of the last projects he did. In fact, he probably didn't even finish it. And another one, I think about the same time, the Thomas Woodbridge House. And the last place you expect to see a McIntire, if you drive up Bridge Street, like you're going to the bridge to go over to Beverly, on your left on the corner of March Street, tucked in with all this industrial stuff, is another McIntire. And that was built for Thomas Woodbridge. And of course, it was a whole different neighborhood back then. There wasn't too much going on up in that area, especially on the street itself or whatever. But this was for many years Children's Friend and Family. I'm sure some people remember that. So again, that was one of those late life projects. He died in 1811. But let's really focus on, for the time we have left, on the district that bears his name, the McIntire Historic District. And there's a bunch of maps of the district floating around. So I picked this one, but look in the bottom right. See my cursor? See, they spelled McIntire with a Y instead of an I. And I got a chuckle out of that because the first thing I ever had published in print, I did the same thing. So I'm not too critical of them. But the McIntire District is the largest of the four by far. It's got over 400 buildings, a couple of graveyards, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, but and it's really surrounded on three sides by these ancient roads. In the upper right corner, you've got North Street that sort of becomes Summer Street. That was a early 17th century road. And listen to this. When you got down to Summer, if you were coming from North Salem to go to, say you wanted to go to South Salem or to Marblehead in the 17th century, you came down Summer Street to High, and go down High, which goes behind Steve's Market, that tiny little street. It's one way. And that's how you got to Marblehead, because there was a bridge at the bottom of it or whatever. So, but, and then Broad Street, of course, was an ancient way. And below it was a lot of old fields that were owned at various times by Endicotts and Pickerings and Hathorns and other families. If you went to the end of Broad, you turn right on a little bit of Essex and Boston. Those were ancient roads. They were used in the 17th century. And interesting, the Bridge Street up at the very top, I can't see it, maybe you can on your screen. Bridge Street wasn't around until about 1891 when they filled in a lot of the North River. But the main road, and again, one of the two major byways in Salem when the white men got here, was Essex Street. And there you go. Essex bisects the middle of the district, but the heart and soul of the district, really architecturally, or at least for its international fame, is Chestnut Street. And then above it is Federal Street. So we'll talk a little bit about those. But now the historic district movement in Salem started later than it should have, and it started on Chestnut Street. And in 1971, two doctors owned this house at the corner of Hamilton and Chestnut, and Greek Revival, but obviously not a McIntire. But anyway, they owned it, and it fit in nicely enough with this street. There was a mix of things in between the various federal buildings. And all of a sudden, the neighbors woke up one day, and their siding was going on, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. And they were kicking themselves because at meetings of the neighborhood association for the prior year or two, they had been saying, we ought to really create a historic district here, because by legislation in Massachusetts, you could do that. So, protect the street. Well, they got lazy and they didn't get around to it. So there was nothing they could do except stand out front and protest. And on the left there is a young Jerry Burns and Bob Murray. What a godsend he was to Salem in the 70s. And then in the middle, Helen Usher, and the neighborhood just, you know, fought and picketed away, but there's nothing they could do. And that thing was cited until a few years ago. So what happens because of that is the neighborhood gets together and they lock the barn door. And in 1971, the historic district is formed. So now they've got a little layer of protection. 5 years later, Federal Street, a couple of streets over, and again, a street that's really, it's magnificent. I love to just look down. You have all these collaborative houses, and they're all right on the sidewalk, no front yards, and creates this wonderful streetscape. And they're all different colors. If this were in color, you could see that. But anyway, the Federal Street Historic District was created in 76. And then finally, somebody along the way said, you know what? This whole area from Bridge Street all the way to Broad and a little bit beyond should be a historic district. So they created the historic district and named it for Samuel McIntire. So let's start our tour of that district and just look at least some of the highlights. And we'll start it at what I've always called McIntire Corner, and legitimately so. And this little park here, I'm sure everybody knows where it is, right across from Hamilton Hall. This was actually known as McIntire Park when it was created around 1950. And but it's had a fascinating history, but the McIntire connection to it was around 1804, again, right in that era. Samuel McIntire was hired by the South Church to design a building for them. And they were an Orthodox congregation society, and they had plenty of money. Timothy Pickering was sort of spearheaded the movement to, you know, set this congregation up. I think they escaped from the Tabernacle, maybe, you know, there were all these whatever, schisms, whatever. And McIntire went up to Exeter, New Hampshire to look at church steeples, and he went to Newburyport and he said, in Newburyport, he found his steeple. So this thing was like 163 feet high. And so it's just absolutely dominated Chestnut Street. It was built really early on, just as Chestnut Street was coming into its own. A note about Chestnut Street: it was laid out as a street in 1796, but the real building didn't start around the time of this church, around 1804. And one of the reasons, and I guarantee you this, is in the year before, in the national and local elections, the Jeffersonian Republicans had really put the lumber to the Federalists. And, you know, they didn't like each other at all, and things were getting very ugly between them. And one of the reasons Chestnut Street suddenly built and built and built over the next 10 years, whatever, was just, it became their escape, their retreat. They built their own school for boys. They had a church there. They had a function hall, and, you know, they could just sort of remove to this part of town. And McIntire did a lot of work up here for that reason, as we'll see in the next few minutes. So he built this church, and right across the street, just a little bit later, a year or two later, he built Hamilton Hall. And this was the Federalist Clubhouse. As the neighborhood grew in terms of population and focus, you know, they decided they needed a place to gather and have their assemblies, et cetera. So McIntire was brought in to design Hamilton Hall, and they still have the plans at the Peabody Essex Museum. But look at this. Now you can see the full influence of Bullfinch and that whole Adam S. Federal style, which was, again, very derivative of Palladian architecture. And you can see those Palladian windows on the second floor. You know, you've got that round arch window with the two side lights, just like the doorways really on a lot of these buildings. And again, very symmetrical. The doorways, it's a little bit funny because you've got 3 windows on the left and 2 on the right, which is kind of unusual, but they get it back together in the middle. And on the 3rd floor, you see those wonderful carvings, these reliefs. And of course, the one in the middle, the eagle, they just took down the original eagle a few years ago and put it inside and put a replica up because it was getting seriously damaged or whatever. So McIntire designed this building, and it was the clubhouse. And of course, for the minister across the way, it wasn't really a very good fit because they were very orthodox and really against dancing and theater and music or a lot of other stuff. And, you know, the minister, I'm sure everybody's heard this, he looked across the street and he said, back to back, breast to breast, they're dancing their way down to hell or whatever. But I always say they're still dancing there. The COVID isn't here and the church is long gone. So maybe there was something he didn't know. But then the doorway around the other side, the one that's mainly used, was added later on. Now, so McIntire had a church on one corner, Hamilton Hall on the other corner, and just one door in from that intersection on the northwest, you had McIntire's. I showed this earlier while you were waiting to start the lecture, was the Joseph Hodges house. And the plans for that are also in the the Peabody Essex Museum. And this originally, in its early days, was a two-family, and then later remodeled as a single family. And fascinating story, the Chestnut Street Associates bought that at one point in the late 30s or early 40s for very short money and held it for a while until they found the right buyer. You know, kind of an interesting story. But and then right around the corner on Cambridge Street, the fourth building with the McIntire connection. And again, it sits right, if you came out the side door of Hamilton Hall into Cambridge Street, right across the street, you're looking at the Buttman House. And again, this was designed by McIntire, you know, early 1800s, that first few years, about the same time he was working on the other ones in the corner. I don't know when the guy slept. I mean, he didn't do the building. He had people like, you know, George Bancroft and other ones. You know, he worked with builders, but he had to be an awful busy guy, you know. But anyway, this was another McIntire, and remember Jim Ballou owned this for many, many years, and that was very appropriate given his sensitivity to architecture and preservation. You know, so you had a McIntire really within 50 feet of every corner of that intersection. So. And just next to the park, I always put this one in because one of the things with the Adam S. Federal buildings, a lot of them tended to be like rectangular rather than square. And look at this one. It's only like, I think, one room deep. You know, you get a look at it from the side. But again, you've got that classic doorway with the window over it. Now, you see that the doorway is like a fanlight window, and it's got those radiating spokes. Every once in a while, you'll see one, and it will have, instead of those spokes, it will have round circles with these little symbols in them. And those are the Chinese symbol for wealth. And you see them on a lot of the Adam S. Federal buildings. But, and, you know, up and down the street, if you took somebody who was an architectural expert and knew a little bit about McIntire, but didn't know which houses to attribute to him, you could walk them down the street on Chestnut Street, say, well, that was built by McIntire. And they go, oh, really? And, you know, they'd be fooled because McIntire's style is so prevalent on the street. But other than those four buildings I showed you, there's other ones with some connection, they think, but you know, a lot of them certainly have that style. But one of the charming things about the historic district over there, there's these cute little sideways, and this is Bott's Court. Everybody in town wants to own this charming little building here on Bott's Court or whatever, but it's too late. Somebody else got to it or whatever. But Bott's Court is this charming thing, and water used to flow down that street. But now Federal Street is the other main one of the other main thoroughfares that runs parallel to Chestnut Street. It was actually laid out prior to Chestnut Street. It was laid out before the Revolutionary War. It was called Bank Street because it sort of sat atop the river bank to the North River at that point in time. And there's another clumping of McIntires up here, just like there is at McIntire Corner. And this is the Cook Oliver House, built around 1801, 1802 for Samuel Cook. And I think at one point he ran out of money. As I remember, these things come to me. I think the story is he ran out of money and he told the builders, I'm sorry, I can't pay it. And they said, well, we'll finish it and let's see what happens. And then things worked out. I think that was the story. And then Henry Kemble Oliver, one of the most amazing men ever to live in Salem, owned it later on. And so, but this was a McIntire house. And, you know, again, it's of wood. You've got that belt course that runs between the first and second floor. And, you know, it's wood, a lot of the carving. He just carved on the fence post. He carved everything here, you know, so it's a beautiful house. And this is the Clifford House. And I mentioned it in a lecture about Federal Street, I don't know, a long time ago. And Fran Clifford's son, Peter, called me afterwards. He says, hey, you know, back in the 20s, the Metropolitan Museum in New York came here and they took some of the McIntire carving out of here. And they said, now they don't know where it is. We called them because we wanted to get pictures of it. They said they don't know where it is. So before you give anything to anybody, protect yourself. But, and then right across the street, built again around the same time, you know, those first few years of 1800, 1805, was a Benjamin Carpenter house. And it's tragic, you know, I love this house and the fence just goes on forever either way. But the tragic thing was this, somebody later on during the Victorian era came in and did a redo of it. And they took the facade off, you know, this wonderful Adam S. Federal building, and redid it and changed a lot of the, you know, went to match boards. They put heavier hoods over the windows and changed the doorway and sort of paid tribute to the old doorway, maybe by adding a little fanlight window, but sorry, too late. And then anyway, they changed the whole facade completely, and which is too bad. I think this was Salem's first $1 million house, I think. But anyway, and almost directly across the street from that is a building where McIntire put the facade on. So you got one, you lost the facade, and one, you got one on. And what happened, this building was built in 80s, I think, 1780s dates, I don't know. But anyway, it was a clubhouse, and for a lot of the wealthy ship owners in town. And Lafayette was honored here in 84, and George Washington in 89, they had parties for him. So it was a real big deal. And then what happened in the early 90s, a couple, the stockholders, real sharp operators and entrepreneurs, they quietly bought up a lot of shares of stock from other people that weren't interested in having them anymore. And one day they owned controlling stock and they shut it down. And they built a place in downtown Salem and used that instead. And people had no choice but to go along with them. So this became a private residence for Samuel Putnam, became a big judge or whatever. So McIntire was brought in to do some of the redo exterior and interior. So, he put these wonderful second floor pilasters there with the Corinthian capitals there. And he put this pediment up top with a lunette in the middle of it, again, paying tribute to that whole Adam S. Federal style with the fan light. And then this little belt course that runs between this first and second floor. So he turned in really a beautiful private residence. I don't think the doorway was his, that was added later on or whatever. But so he, what was taken away on the other side of the street was added on this side. But it was interesting. The building that the entrepreneurs built was right in Townhouse Square. It was where now Fountain Place. It took up that whole area there. And the top floor they had, and I think it was called the Stearns Block. And I think McIntire designed the building, but he designed this interior ballroom. So what a tragic loss this was. The picture doesn't do it justice, obviously. So those three buildings are really just like McIntire Corner. They're just right almost across the street or next door to each other. And further down the street, almost to North Street, you can see North in the background. I'm sure everybody recognizes this building. This is the Pierce Nichols house, Peirce. And it may have been his first full commission, the first house he might have finished. I don't know. There's speculation. It's attributed by tradition to McIntire. The family's kept records forever, back and forth, written books about their time in Salem, et cetera. But anyway, the building was built in the 1780s, early 1780s. And at that point, again, you're in that late Georgian, early Federal period. And the buildings look like Adam S. Federal buildings of later in terms of their overall style and layout or whatever, but they were a lot more heavily massed. And what happens is McIntire, 20 years after he built that, came back and redid a couple of the rooms in the central hallway on the eastern side or to the right of the doorway. And so it's kind of cool when you go in there. If you go left, you see the old original sort of much heavier carving and mantles, et cetera. And then you go to the right and it's got this more delicate Adam S. Federal style. And of course, you also have out back this wonderful carriage house and stables. And it's really cool. If you go through that arch, if you've never done it, you should do it sometime. You can walk around, go back there, because they have this terrace lawn that slopes down to what was the North River, now Bridge Street. And of course, this was owned by Jerthmile Peirce, who along with his partner Wade owned the Friendship and the original Friendship. And Peirce had his wharf down there by the North Bridge at that time. And one of the cool things with Federal Street was you start at North and you just walk down the side. As I said, you see one right after the other, especially on the north side, just one collaborative house after the other. And then when you get a little bit further up, you see things start changing architecturally, and you have a handful of Italianate buildings, and then interspersed, especially as you get further down the street, they have all sorts of Italianate and Victorian style buildings, so it's a nice mix. But the first block is just delightful to look. And as I said, once they all get painted different colors, it's just fascinating to me visually. But one of the charming little thing is River Street that goes off of Federal and sort of winds its way, and literally winds its way down to Bridge, and just an absolutely charming, very, very tiny, very narrow, and sort of a little neighborhood unto itself. But again, you see one house after the other right on the sidewalk and all collaborated, and again, a lot of different color paints, whatever. But Essex Street's, the main thoroughfare. And one of the things with Essex, you just don't notice a lot of the architecture. And because, you're driving, you better be watching where you're going. And but to get out and walk it, especially with the camera, is a whole different thing. And this is a view from Jerry's Army and Navy, now Which City Consignment. And you're looking across the street, the zoom. John Goff, who I miss him horribly. John and I did a tour once for a little architectural firm from Boston. He did the architecture and I did social history and stuff. But we started here and we couldn't shut them up. They were going crazy. They said, look at this. You've got a 17th century, the witch house. You've got like a 18th century Gambell roof Georgian house. And then in the back, you've got a Gothic revival church, and you haven't even moved, you know. We said, wait till you see the rest of the street. And that, in fact, is the beauty of Essex Street, you know. And you have a couple doors down, the old Ropes Mansion, again, an early Georgian with that gambrel roof and the dormers and the roof line. And then further down across from the library, you have the old Cabot Low Endicott house. It's got about 600 names, but look at the size of that. They've got 5 bays, but then off to the side, they've added a couple more. And, you know, this thing was built before the Revolution, and the size of it is just absolutely the scale. And on the right, you'll see those corner coins, these little things sticking out, and these little things under the roof line there, those things sticking out that look like teeth, are called dental. So kids think that's the greatest thing on earth, you know. But, and again, in that Georgian style where you have the gambrel roof, it always came with this pedimented doorway, you know, nothing fancy, little transom window maybe rather than the fan light. But then the further you get down, you see these outrageous buildings built in the Victorian and Italianate era. And this is my favorite house in Salem. I mean, you look at how big it is for starters, but you look at how high the foundation is. Look at how many stairs you have to go up just to get to the first floor. And everything is paired. And then on either side, either of these wings are rounded. You look at how do they do all this stuff? Paired windows, and look at the brackets above each one. They change. And then up here, they've got these little pair eyebrow things, but then for reason, they mustn't need light. They squeeze these little suckers in up top. And, you know, you've got this drip molding and all this bracketing and whatever, just, you know, outrageous. And they just painted it some interesting green, but I love the house, you know. But then a couple of doors down, they've got, you know, another from that era. Again, you've got those rounded bays. And so the further you go down the street, the more, you know, fascinating really the architecture and more diverse it becomes. But there aren't too many places where you're going to see within 100 yards. And one day I stepped it off, and it's almost 100 yards to have 2 libraries, you know. And one of them, of course, is the old Salem Athenaeum, you know, a private library with some obviously public access, whatever. But that was created at the end of McIntire's lifetime in 1810. He died in 1811. But obviously, this was not in its original location, you know. But and then a couple, 100 yards down, practically on the street on the other side, you have the old John Bertram home, which became a Salem library or whatever. And you can see, again, it was that Italianate style. And what they did, they had a lot of brick and brownstone. And the trouble with brownstone, I mean, it's beautiful, but apparently it's really, really susceptible to acid rain and really can take an awful beating. But anyway, what a wonderful use for a building this exquisite to have it become the Salem Library. And right behind the library is one of our newest architectural treasures. And if you don't know John Hermansky, you got to meet him, because I've known him for years, you know, and, but, you know, just hello to, you know, we've had these casual conversations. He worked in the computer business, but I went on their house on a Christmas tour a few years ago, and I was saying, well, a lot of the furniture here was made by John, and a lot of this incredible, like, colonial curtains were made by John. I mean, he could do anything. And then in recent years, he has built this absolutely exquisite sort of Adam S. Federal place where you can store your snowblower and other stuff like that or whatever. Unbelievable job. And then further down, past the library, you have one of the 2 graveyards. And of course, that's the Quaker cemetery. And I posted this picture in color recently on Facebook because so many of the houses around are all different colors and unusual colors. And everybody's going, where's that? Where's that? And it's one of the secrets of Salem, but it's really halfway between the library and Boston Street on Essex Street. And it's the old Friends Quaker Cemetery or whatever. And the other thing, and I don't think I have it for whatever reason, the other major cemetery, of course, is right across the street from the Pickering House on Broad Street. And somehow I think I forgot to find that. But anyway, end up on Broad Street and pay tribute to our hosts here. And there I can see Linda. This is the Pickering House right behind us, and really one of the oldest houses in Salem. You lost a few years after the testing, right, Linda? You went from 1751 or 1651 to 1660 or something, but it doesn't matter. You know, it's really, I think 10 or 11 jet.
When I arrived, it was 1651, and about a couple of years later, it was 1660.
Yeah, that's what I thought. You know, about 8,000 generations of Pickerings lived there, including Timothy Pickering, who was such a major player in the early days of the American Republic. And what happened to this building was it was Gothicized over the years. You can see, you know, that's not a 17th century fence or whatever. And you can see the You know, the roof line is different or whatever too. But so, and across from the Pickering House, you have those 3 school buildings, and the one on the furthest to the east on the corner of Summer Street was the old Salem State College, the normal school. And as I said, they tore down McIntire's Registry of Deeds to build that. And then it was abandoned by the college at about 1896, 7, somewhere around there. So now it's condominiums. And then in the middle was the old Oliver School. And then off to the right is the building that's about to become condos, I think, if I'm not mistaken, is the old Salem High School or whatever. So, you know, they're all included in the McIntire district. And the district, if you went down Broad Street, both sides of Broad Street are covered, but there's this little bump out done south, and it was done specifically to include Orange Square. You know, and Orange Square, really, most of it was burned during the Salem fire, but after the fire, because that fire went right down the street and wiped out a lot of, in fact, I'm glad I mentioned that, because the New York Times reported the day after the Salem fire that Chestnut Street had burned, the library had burned, all these people had lost their lives. So mercifully, they were wrong on that, you know, and it did take out a corner of Warren Street. So that district is actually, this whole McIntire district is very lucky to be here. If it weren't for like God taking the wind and changing it, and the firemen putting up one hell of a battle at the corner of Boston and Bridge and going down a little bit towards Federal on Boston Street, you know, this whole area was gone, absolutely gone. Instead, what happened was the fire burned south a little bit up towards Highland Avenue and then burned down, you know, Warren and Jackson. So mercifully, it was all saved. But after the fire, they built these wonderful little stucco buildings. It's now Orange Square. And really, one of the other little streets that's kind of ignored there, but absolutely charming, is Warren Street. And Warren Street has all these little carriage houses and garages. And this one, I think it might be even 2-family. I don't know. It's just an old carriage house on Warren Street for one of the for the Chestnut Street mansions. It's corner of Warren and Flint. But the I remember they used to have a school for the boys on Chestnut Street. I remember reading, they moved it to Green Street. So I went up to Green Street in South Salem and rode all over looking for it or whatever. And turned out Warren Street used to be called Green Street. So they didn't have to move it very far or whatever. And the district, when it gets up, you know, I'm sure everybody knows, you drive up Broad and then all of a sudden Broad splits and becomes Dalton and Broad. And in the middle of that, and I think just outside of the district, is one of my favorite houses in Salem. Looks like it's got a few issues here, but this building is built after a house in Normandy in France in general style. And it was built by a guy named Festus Russo. And I'm sitting right underneath a big portrait that Festus did. And he taught art at Salem High for like 50 years. You know, and he married a French woman, and he was of French origin, lived at the YMCA for many years. And then he designed his own house and built it. And I think too bad it's not in the district. So that district was named for McIntire. As I said, you know, when you walk down Chestnut particularly, but also parts of Federal as well, you can see a lot of houses that would pass for McIntires, even though they aren't, but his influence is everywhere. And again, he borrowed very heavily from, you know, other architects back in Europe, and he also borrowed very heavily, or was inspired very heavily by Bulfinch or whatever. But he really, McIntire, Bulfinch, Asher, Benjamin, you know, these 3 late 18th, early 19th century guys, you know, they really helped put America on the map architecturally with these wonderful Adamus Federal buildings. So McIntire died in 1811 of lung issues. And if I couldn't find this anywhere, but I think he had saved a drowning girl a year prior to that, and he had some lung issues or whatever, and they did him in. I can't find that story and whatever. But anyway, he's buried in the Charter Street Cemetery, and everybody knows where that is. And when he died, you know, it was a very contentious time, very, very contentious. And you were either with the Federalists or the Jeffersonian Republicans, but he somehow managed to walk that line between them. And the Register and Gazette, 2 newspapers that despised each other, they both wrote the loveliest things about McIntire and gave him a lot of ink. Reverend Bentley, William Bentley, who was really a Jeffersonian Republican, you know, through and through, and one of the leaders of that particular group, you know, when McIntire died, he wrote the nicest things about him, you know, just couldn't say anything nicer about him. And apparently he was just as wonderful as he was talented, very humble. And so on his grave, he put, he was distinguished for genius in architecture, sculpture, and, listen to this, music. Modest and sweet-mannered rendered him pleasing, industry and integrity respectable. He professed the religion of Jesus in his entrance on manly life and proved its excellence by virtuous principle with unblemished conduct or whatever. So, nobody had a bad word to say about the guy, and you probably would have liked to have known him. But the last thing I'll mention is a little thing about music. And, he was very involved with music, and I remember reading somewhere that he made music instruments, he could refix them, he taught music, he would play music, and helped organize music societies, et cetera. And he was involved in all aspects of music. And they actually have in a book that I have somewhere, they have, when he died, what he had for his possessions in his house. And Jesus, just tons of music stuff along with tools and everything else. So anyway, you just can't have asked for a nicer guy, and you just look at his work, and there's something soothing about it. And, he was, again, a brilliant architect, and I didn't even touch on his carving, but as I said, for $114, you can get the Peabody Essex Museum on the carving. And one thing I'll say, one of the things I miss most with the COVID is they used to have the Salem, the book swap. You bring in books to get rid of them and take them. They had it twice a year. And one day, about 3 years ago, I walked into the book swap and I walked over to the history table, and there was a $114 hardcover book on Samuel McIntire, carver of Salem. And I could have gone home after that or whatever. But anyway, great score. So, but anyway, that's a little bit about Samuel McIntire 101 and some of his buildings, a little bit about him, the historic district that bears his name. And one of the cool things with the district is, it's got his name, it's got these great federal buildings. But if you take your time on a day when it might actually be warmer than it has been recently, and you walk through that whole district, the architectural styles are just outrageous. You've got everything, going from top to, and the closer you get to Boston, the more outrageous a lot of them are. So that's it. I can't talk anymore without water, and I'm out of water. So we'll, if anybody has a question or two, except for Ron Olson.
That was terrific. Questions, shout out, raise your hand, unmute yourself, do it in the chat box, whatever you prefer.
Yeah. Jim, did he have children other than Samuel Field?
He had one child, Samuel Field, and he went on, what did he do for a living? He was a McIntire. He did what you all did or whatever, but so, and in fact, he worked with his father a lot, and he probably finished up some of his projects. They think he might have finished up Brook House, but again, the great book is, I'll just hold it up here. Can you see this architecture in Salem?
Mm-hmm.
You want specifics on any house, this is where it's at. And of course, Brian Tolles, was head of the Essex Institute and really an architectural historian. So, but you can get it for like $20 at the trolley depot or someplace. But
Jim?
Yep.
When did the house on the corner of Hamilton and Essex Street become aluminum sided?
Hamilton?
The Hinchy house.
Oh God. As long as I can remember, I don't know. I couldn't tell you, but yeah, it's like bookends, isn't it?
Yeah.
Remember that movie, The Tin Man?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. Yeah. But now you talk about architecture. I don't know the answer to your question, but what a fascinating building that is.
It is.
Architecturally, and the coloring is interesting. But
well, the inside is beautiful.
Yeah. It's doctor's office, right?
It was.
Yeah. Charlie Hinchy was fascinating. What an amazing guy he was.
You can play the program.
Pardon?
I need to mute.
Frank Clifford's house.
Anybody else?
The only one.
Yes. When did shutters come and go? Window shutters.
I don't know. How's that, huh? I knew it one time. That and basements are two things I've looked up 1,000 times and then forgotten or whatever. I'm not a building guy as a rule, but it's like the anchor in front of the Peabody Essex. I've looked that up 100 times, which ship it's from, but I'm old. I can't remember half this stuff.
Jim, we're the same age. Be careful.
Yeah, right. You're old too. But so anyway, is that it?
Can we let people go to their dinners and their?
Oh yeah. So,
all right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
And appreciate it.
Thank you, Jim.